Hello and welcome to the UN General Assembly.
Welcome to Al Jazeera.
7 billion people.
193 nations.
$26 billion needed to solve the suffering. That's our world.
70 years after the UN was created, the next Secretary General needs to confront crisis out there,
while leading reform in here. Tonight, in the first ever live televised debate, we'll hear from diplomats and the global community affected by their decisions.
And we'll hear from the men and women who believe they're ready to take over from Ban Ki-moon.
12 candidates are vying for the post of UN Secretary General. 10 of them are with us here today on Al Jazeera.
And we're joined first by a panel of 5 of them. Let me introduce them to you. We start with Vesna Pusic.
Antonio Guterres.
Susanna Malcorra.
Vuk Jeremic.
And Natalia Gurman.
Thank you all for taking part in this historic event. We're broadcasting live from the UN General Assembly, a packed UN General Assembly hall.
And we're live on Al Jazeera channels and platforms around the world. I'm James Bays.
And I'm Folly Thibault. Bienvenue au débat des candidats au poste de secrétaire général des Nations Unies.
Welcome to the UN debate. Let's get things started, and the way we're going to start this is hearing from each of the candidates about themselves and why they want to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. Candidates, you're going to get 90 seconds for this answer to make your pitch, to set out your stall. Let's start with Vesna Pusic, Croatia's Deputy Speaker of Parliament. She's also the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, and thank you, General Assembly. Thank you, President of the General Assembly, for giving us this opportunity. It's really a first, as you know. And why do I want to do this difficult, complicated job in difficult, complicated times? I've done many things in my life. I've taught, I've been a teacher, I've been a civil society activist, I've been a parliamentarian, I've been a minister. But throughout my life, the topic of peace, development, and human rights have been absolutely center stage for me. And whatever I did, I focused on these topics, from looking at my neighborhood to looking at the world. So in that sense, it comes very natural to me to think of the organization that actually has made these 3 topics the center of its activity and interest. But the other thing that motivated me is a deep resentment or antipathy towards cynicism. And there has been a lot, and there is a lot of cynicism in current international relations, national politics, international politics, a lot of sort of playing to the gallery without being prepared to look at the issues. And I want to actually counter that cynicism. This is what I will try.
Thank you very much. Next, Antonio Guterres, High Commissioner for Refugees from 2005 until last year, 2015. He was also Portugal's Prime Minister.
Well, I'm a candidate because this is the place where I believe I can better help to reduce human suffering and offer better opportunities for people. We live in a dangerous world. We see a multiplication of new conflicts. Old conflicts never die, and conflicts are becoming more and more interrelated and interconnected with the global threat of terrorism. At the same time, climate change and population growth are combining to make the world smaller and resources scarcer. And we see people, common people, more and more divorced in relation to national political establishments, but also international organizations. See, for instance, the EU and even the UN in certain aspects. So I believe that we badly need at this moment two things: leadership and values. Now, in a complex world, we need a multiplicity of leaders able to fully assume their responsibilities. The Secretary General is just one of them. But she or he must be a solid ethical reference and must be the symbol of those truly universal values that are enshrined in the UN Charter and that all religions respect in the world. The values that our societies, that are all becoming multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multicultural, need in order to foster inclusion, cohesion, to make people feel they belong, to value diversity, and to confront and defeat political populism, xenophobia, racism, and violent extremism. And I believe those values are the values I've served in all my life.
Thank you. Susana Malcorra is Argentina's Minister of Foreign Affairs. She was also Chef de Cabinet for Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. That, for those that don't know, is effectively the Chief of Staff.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. You know, I came to the United Nations 12 years ago without fully grasping what the United Nations means to the world. And I realized then that in today's complex landscape, the needs and demands of communities and peoples go far beyond their frontiers. So that means that the world demands today a United Nations that is closer to the people, much closer, that puts people and planet up front, and that is driven by the reality of issues and the need to deliver results, a results-driven organization. In my view, to rise to meet the world's expectations, this United Nations requires a Secretary General with the courage to lead, the humility to listen, and the readiness to partner. And I think I am that person. Having been so close to the decision making, I think I fully understand what is needed to take the United Nations to the next level. In the private sector for 25 years, I learned the pressures of delivering results for the shareholders. Let me tell you, nothing is equivalent to the pressure that you feel in this organization when you know that you are saving lives. I am here for that United Nations that we all need and we all want, and I hope to get your trust.
Thank you. Vuk Jeremic served as the president of the 67th session of the United Nations General Assembly. He was also the foreign minister of Serbia.
Well, thank you very much, this is a great privilege. First and foremost, thank you, Mr. President, for according us this privilege. Ladies and gentlemen, we do live in an era of profound transformation that is unprecedented in scale and scope. And most of the challenges that are facing humanity in the 21st century are essentially global in nature. There's only one organization that we are going to have in our lifetime where we can hope to come together and address them decisively, and this is the United Nations. Now, not all is well at the United Nations, I'm afraid. There's a growing perception that some historic achievements made by this organization are becoming more and more overshadowed by the sense of stagnation and failure. Now, we've got to do something about it, and we've got to do it fast. I believe this is not a time for high rhetoric. I believe this is time for decisive action. And to that end, I decided to put forward a detailed public policy platform, which I made publicly available for those of you who do not know. It contains 53 concrete commitments that I am prepared to carry out from day one in the fields of sustainable development, climate change, conflict prevention and peace operations, human rights and humanitarian relief, and the organization reform itself. I believe we need to change. I believe we need to have a clear plan on how to do it. I believe I have a plan on how to do it, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much indeed. Natalia Gurman is the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Moldova. She was also Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure and honor to be here. And I am a candidate for the position of the Secretary General of the United Nations because I do believe in the commitment of humanity for collective action for the better life of everybody. And I'm absolutely convinced that the United Nations is the preeminent international organization which we can use to deliver on this commitment. And I also trust the power of dialogue and the power of persuasion. As Foreign Minister of the Republic of Moldova, I had only diplomacy and dialogue to help establish a place for my country in the system of international affairs. And I also bring the first-hand experience of identifying the common ground, even amidst geopolitical tensions, where others might see only differences that serve nobody. And even if I am aware that very often a Secretary General should manage disunity, I think we should all strive for finding common ground and finding unity. And we need this unity whether we are to stop wars and conflicts, tackle the scourge of international terrorism, work on international development, or ensure the highest standards of dignity. This experience I am bringing to the service of the organization and to the service of humanity. Thank you.
Well, there we have it. The candidates have had 90 seconds each to set out their stall why they want this job. Now we go to the detailed questions, and the rules change slightly. From now on, 60 seconds only to answer the questions, and that's so we can hear as much as possible from all the candidates on as many topics as possible during this first hour of the UN debate. You're going to get questions from me, you're going to get questions from Folly, and questions from people here in the General Assembly, and Folly is out in the audience right now.
Yes, James, thank you, and thank you to the candidates as well. Now that we've heard why you want to be UN Secretary General and your vision of the United Nations for 2017 and beyond, we want to get to know you more as a person now. So we'll go to our first question of the evening, which is from the Hungarian ambassador to the United Nations, Katalin Borzsói. Thank you so much. Your question to the candidates.
Nice to see you. My question is, what kind of leadership is needed today? What do you think what the UN needs today and what the world needs today as a leader here in the United Nations? And if elected, how would you like to translate what we do here in the UN to the outside world? In the world of communication, how would you really make understandable the importance of our work?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your question. A very interesting and important question, which we'll put to Ms. Vesna Pusic first. A question about leadership style first. I imagine it's a question that you've been asked many times, a bit of a cliche question. Do you see yourself more as a secretary or a general?
Yeah, I heard that one very many times, and I think everybody is a combination of both. But the specific question, what kind of leadership? And I think this is a very important question because what happened over the past 20 years, I think that the criteria have actually been lowered, and that the sort of fast track for populist has created an atmosphere in which catchy phrases and lack of responsibility is the name of the game. You have to be popular. You have to say things that will sort of catch people's attention or scare them. I don't think that's the leadership we need. I think the leadership we need is deep conviction, vision, perseverance and courage. And sometimes courage to be even in the minority of one. Because sometimes when you're in the minority of one, over time, if you know that you're going in the right direction, you'll get support.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response, Ms. Pusic. The same question to you, Natalia Gurman, about your leadership style. What kind of a diplomat are you going to be as a Secretary General? Are you going to be a quiet diplomat, as we've seen in the last 8 years at the UN, or are you going to be more of an aggressive one?
Thank you. On the issue of Secretary or General, I made myself very clear at the informal debates in the General Assembly. I'm planning to be the General of the Secretariat and UN system and the Secretary of the Member States. And this is the leadership that I have in mind, because it does require a change of the mindset. You have to be proactive and not reactive, and you have to be this moral commitment and moral authority to articulate to the citizens of the world the problems and the challenges that otherwise would never be articulated. Either we are speaking about the sustaining peace or working on delivering on sustainable development goals, or preserving the standards for human rights and human dignity all over the world. So from this particular point of view, I do believe that this time we don't have the right to fail. We have to succeed in order for the future generation to be able to continue and hopefully live a better life.
Thank you. Next question for Antonio Guterres, and it's a question about the skills of the Secretary General, and you know the current Secretary General much better than me, but I've interviewed him a fair few times. He's a tireless worker, but many have criticised perhaps his communication skills. How are you going to communicate the message of the United Nations, and how perhaps are you going to use the new forms of communication, for example social media, which maybe allows you to communicate beyond the halls of the UN directly with the people?
Well, first of all, I do not intend to criticize my predecessor. I think he has made a fantastic effort and a remarkable job. In the modern world, communication is absolutely crucial. And a serious problem we have in the UN, like other international organizations, is that there is a kind of a cipher language that nobody understands except those that live in the organization. So what we need is to translate the many important initiatives the UN has, the many important things the UN does for the world, into a language that everybody understands. And this, to be honest, is what I've done all my life, especially as a political leader in my own party and in my own government. We need to speak clearly, we need to make people understand, we need to speak with the language that everybody uses. But leadership is not only communication. Leadership is essentially substance. You can never win a battle by communication if the substance of that communication is not embedded in the values that are necessary in today's world.
Next question is for Vuk Jeremic. I'd like to perhaps see if you have a different perspective, because I know your country quite well, and if you go back not that far back in history, I was reporting from your country. It was bombed for 99 days by NATO. I know that wasn't authorized by the UN. At one stage, your country under Milosevic was the pariah country. Does that give you a different perspective on the international community and the way it works?
Well, basically, when I was a young man, I witnessed the consequences of the catastrophic failure in diplomacy and a surge in poverty and absence of the rule of law. So I witnessed it firsthand, and as a young man I did fight for democracy and for human rights myself. I worked hard so that Serbia together is a democracy. But today here I am speaking for the wider audience and about the wider questions that relate to what kind of leadership we need in the United Nations. I believe we do need an action-oriented leadership, people with concrete plans. I think that having served in the UN, having been elected to preside over this chamber a few years ago, I've heard too many UN speeches. And I think this is not a time for high rhetoric, but action and concrete goals. And I think that in order to be able to inspire again humanity in the way that this organization was inspiring it in the last century, we need to make it more transparent and more accessible to the peoples of the world.
Thank you very much for that answer. We are going to move on to our next section of questions, which is about conflict and crisis. And there is so much to talk about here when you look at the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. We'll come to some of those in a moment, but I think we should start with the situation that's in the news right now, the appalling things we've seen in the last 5 days in South Sudan. Susanna Malcorra, bloodbath on the streets, over 300 people dead, and yet there's UN peacekeepers there, plenty of UN peacekeepers. They're locked down in their bases. Should they be locked down in their bases, or should they be doing what they're mandated to do, protect people? What's your view?
Well, first of all, it's deeply disturbing what is happening in South Sudan. That nation was brought to life through the fight of their people, but also with the full support of the international community and the United Nations. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And what you see there is a total lack of leadership to take the nation forward. I mean, the infighting between the different leaders is the reason for this. It's the notion of not having a view for the future of their people. I think it's clear that the mission in South Sudan has a mandate to protect people. It's not mandated to fight or to see how to stop the fighting between these two parties within the party. But it's also true that there is a need for a solution to that. So my sense, and I understand that's the case, the Security Council is discussing this. We need to find a way to strengthen and to find alternatives to what is in the ground today. But in the end, it is in the hands of the leadership of South Sudan to decide that they own that country and they owe it to their own people.
Next question to Vesna Prusic. The UN went there to try and nurture the world's newest country. What went wrong? How much of the blame is on the local political players? Is there any blame on the United Nations in your view?
I guess there is sufficient blame to go around, actually. Something that I think happened, and not only in South Sudan, but I think we've seen it in many places around the world, that there was no sufficient understanding of the nature of that society and the nature of that country. I remember that many years ago, when the situation in Iraq was discussed, there were some people who weren't actually aware that there were Shia and Sunni in Iraq. And to some extent, this is also the situation in South Sudan. It is a divided society. It always was a divided society, and it was approached to some extent as a society that when they see institutions of democracy, they will all fall into place. This is not the case. You need much more, not only soldiers on the ground, but actually, activists, politicians, people with hands-on being present in a country like that.
Thank you very much for that. We are now going to take another question from one of our distinguished guests here in the audience on the floor of the UN General Assembly. And we're going to hear from the Justice Minister of Senegal now, Mr. Siddiq Kaba, who is going to be speaking in French, and I will translate afterwards the question to you.
Merci. La justice internationale est considérée par certains comme sélective et discriminatoire à l'endroit de l'Afrique, dont les représentants sont les plus nombreux devant la Cour pénale internationale. Quelles actions comptez-vous entreprendre pour changer cette perception négative? Et que comptez-vous faire pour convaincre les grandes puissances et les autres États concernés qui n'ont pas encore ratifié le statut de Rome pour qu'ils le fassent afin qu'il y ait une justice universelle effective. Je vous remercie.
Mr. Kaba, thank you very much. A very important question indeed for the candidates. Mr. Kaba asks, he says international justice is seen by many as selective and discriminatory against Africans who make up the largest number of nationals brought before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. What actions are you going to take as Secretary General to change these negative perceptions, and how do you convince states that haven't ratified the Rome Statute to do so for there to be effective universal justice? Mr. Guterres, you may answer that question. How do you address the perceived bias against Africa at the International Criminal Court?
Do you mind repeating? Because
I think Mr. Guterres is having a little difficulty hearing,
Yes.
hearing some of the questions. But it's about bias on the International Criminal Court and bias against Africa.
Je dois dire que je crois que la Cour internationale, la Cour criminelle internationale est un pas extrêmement important dans le développement d'une justice pénale internationale et de l'état de droit au niveau global. Et je crois qu'il faut dire à l'Afrique que c'est à l'honneur de l'Afrique le fait que la plupart des pays qui ont ratifié le traité et qui ont des problèmes, ce sont des pays africains. Et ça, c'est quelque chose que les autres devraient copier, parce que c'est un exemple remarquable de la capacité africaine de comprendre l'importance de la justice internationale. Ce que je crois qu'il faut, c'est de faire un grand effort pour élargir le nombre d'États qui acceptent la juridiction de la Cour, et en même temps d'avoir de la part des organes qui ont le pouvoir de décision à cet égard, la possibilité de saisir la Cour quand les droits sont violés d'une façon absolument dramatique, ce qui est probablement le cas dans un certain nombre de situations que nous avons dans le monde.
Thank you, Mr. Guterres. I'm going to try to translate that as quickly as I can. Mr. Guterres says, actually, Africa is an example for other countries to follow, that it's in Africa's interest to be in the International Criminal Court, and that more countries should follow Africa's suit. Am I right, Mr. Guterres? Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yes, there should be more countries accepting the jurisdiction at the court, and the court should be more frequently seized when situations justify that fact.
Thank you so much. Mr. Yeremik, the same question to you. Some African countries have threatened to pull out of the ICC, in fact, because of this perceived bias against African leaders. How do you convince them not to?
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Ministre. Bonne question. But I am asked to answer it in English according to the rules, I believe.
I think we prefer to have you all in English.
I did actually take up this important and delicate question when I served as President of the United Nations General Assembly. And I did call for the first ever thematic debate here in this chamber on the role of international criminal justice in advancing peace and reconciliation. It turned out to be a pretty vigorous debate, and I had said quite openly in my General Assembly hearings that I thought that we could have done a better preparation for this. But I do believe in the critical significance of this issue, because international justice in the international courts, in my opinion, are an essential tool of the foreign community, of the international community in our era. I am acutely aware of the sensitivities that Africans have towards it. I think that we need to engage more and more deeply and in a more qualitative way, especially with the African member states, in order to make sure that the future international criminal justice is more perfect than the one that we have today.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. Yeremik. Ms. Malcora, the same question to you about the International Criminal Court's perceived bias against African countries, and also how do we get the Security Council to perhaps be more favorable in certain situations to the ICC. We saw recently a vote on Syria, referring the Syria war to the International Criminal Court, which was turned down by some members of the Security Council. It seems, many Africans will tell you when it comes to Africa, there's unanimity on the Security Council to refer cases to the ICC, but not when it comes to other countries.
Well, it's clear that the minute a country, a region, a sub-region believes to be targeted by justice, justice is not working. So my view is that we need to, first of all, engage with the African countries the way it has been done in the past. Remember in the case of the Kenyan situation, to see what are the adjustments and the changes that could be included in the Rome Statute that will satisfy the needs and the perspective of Africa. But more than that, I think it is very significant that the organization, the Security Council at large, takes into account that there is only one ruler to measure the world. And it cannot be changed and it cannot be adapted to different regions and viewed in different ways. It cannot be the case that differences among the Security Council cause this type of differentiated ruler to measure. And I think Africa has to engage more, not to disengage, because that will be against the notion of justice, the universal justice that we all seek.
Natalia German, thank you so much, Ms. Malcorra, for that. Natalia German, your views on the International Criminal Court, its role in international justice, and whether we can convince the Security Council on Syria, for instance, to refer the Syria war to the ICC, and if not the ICC, what other alternatives are there?
Well, let me tell you the following thing. I'm absolutely convinced that there is no peace without justice, and there is no justice without peace. And having said that, I would like to continue that, well, justice is peace for past and present generations, and peace is justice for future generations. And if we are committed to work together for a sustainable peace, we have to really focus and concentrate our efforts to deploy all available mechanisms, because, as I said, peace is justice for our descendants. And I'm absolutely sure that more debate and also bringing it for the consideration of the Security Council of the United Nations might prove not only useful but actually very helpful in order to improve the current situation, which is absolutely regrettable if we are speaking about Syria.
President Pusic, if we can have your perspective on this same issue and the problems here with referral to the International Criminal Court, because there are only certain ways of doing it, and it seems that in some cases the Security Council is prepared to take action. Other places where they seem to have, some of them, a vested interest, they're not. It's a problem, isn't it?
It is a problem. There are a lot of problems because the system is not perfect. But it's the best we've got. And I absolutely agree that instead of opting out or not participating in the International Criminal Court, on the contrary, as many countries as possible should join. And it will not be perfect. And I come from a country for which the Security Council has actually established a specialized tribunal to process the war crimes that were committed in my country during the war, but also by everybody who participated in the Balkan wars of the 90s. Was it perfect? Far from it. Was it better than not having it? Absolutely. It was really better. Did it reach everybody who should have been reached? No. But it reached some. And it showed that there is always a great danger that in the end, if you commit war crimes, you will be caught. And that's better than nothing.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your responses there on the role of the International Criminal Court. We'll move on now to the next question from the floor here. And with us today on Al Jazeera is David Stanton. He's the Irish Minister for Equality and Immigration.
Thank you very much. The three high-level reviews of the UN's approach to peace and security last year highlighted the need for a greater focus on conflict prevention, resolution and reconciliation. Do you agree that increased resources should be allocated to this area of work, taking note of the recommendation from the review of the peace-building architecture that 1% of the value of the UN peace operations budget should be allocated to this area?
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton, for your question. We'll put that question to Mr. Vuk Jeremic. The issue of conflict prevention. Many questions, of course, have been raised about the capacity of the UN to prevent violent conflicts, especially on the African continent. One example, recent example, is the violence in Burundi, of course, sparked by the extension of the presidential term there. Another crisis looms in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, where the president is also expected to extend his term in office. How can the UN get involved before violence breaks out?
Well, actually, I believe that far greater resources need to be devoted to conflict prevention. And it's not only enough, in my view, to say, yes, we need to do more of preventive diplomacy, because it's kind of obvious, but also to lay out concrete options as to what to do about it. And in my platform, I lay out a very detailed plan on how to, for example, move 20% of staff from the New York offices down to the field, so that there's less paper shuffling in New York and more engagement on the ground with the parties, so that the conflict is prevented. But I think that the essential element of the future peace operations arm of the United Nations needs to involve a significant overhaul of the peace operations. I think that we need to create an entirely new stabilization new generation of stabilization missions that are going to be able to have a much more robust rules of engagement, and that are not going to be in a situation that, for example, the guys in South Sudan were over the last 2 years. Unless we transform into something much more robust, what we have as a peacekeeping arm of the United Nations, we're not going to be able to serve the nations in the 21st century.
Vuk Jeremic, thank you very much. We're talking about conflict prevention. Let me try and use, Natalia Gurman, a concrete example, and perhaps it shows the difficulties here. Diplomats I've spoken to say what they see in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with an election coming up, and it's not clear whether President Kabila will stand in that election, as a slow-motion car crash, but no one knows how to stop it. There is a problem here, isn't there, when conflict prevention and national sovereignty clash?
Well, indeed, if we do look at the conclusions of the review of the peace-building architecture, we all agreed that we need to change the mindset in favor of prevention. And prevention needs to be very clearly articulated and spoken about, and this is where I see one of the major tasks of the Secretary General of the United Nations, also including alerting about the dangers of doing nothing, of not doing enough. And countries and communities where we invested in peacekeeping relapsing into conflict or tensions, such as the case that you brought. But you also have to think about sustainable peace. And sustainable peace does cost. So we have to commit enough resources. We have to make sure that we have the standby arrangements, and we work early enough on human rights and on development. We tackle the issue of poverty, inequality, disenfranchisement of youth, and we do involve women into this peace-building effort. I think now, if we look into that, we might as well obtain better results, but working on communities where they relapsed back into conflict, I think we have to use the mechanisms that I mentioned and make sure that we engage much more proactively.
Okay, Antonio Guterres, the same issue. You've heard other people speak. Tell me what you agree with and what you think needs a different approach.
I think we have two basic problems. First, there is no TV cameras where prevention is done. And so there is no attention and no money. The TV cameras are where the crises erupt. And so there is a lot more attention to peacekeeping and to conflict resolution than to prevention and then to peace building. And what I believe we need is to close this separation, is not to have this fragmentation. Prevention, conflict resolution, peacekeeping, peace building, long-term development, but to be a continuum of peace and to have a continuum action with the same strategy and with the same involvement and the same priority. And second, you mentioned there is a question of different interpretations within the membership about the role of prevention. And some countries tend to consider that it is essential to use a number of tools for early prevention and early action, and some countries tend to say that be careful because there is a risk of interfering in the sovereignty of a state. And this is exactly the kind of places where I believe a Secretary General can act in a humble way, as a bridge builder, as a consensus builder, trying to make people come closely together. When two people are together, there are six. What each one is, what each one thinks he is, and what each one thinks the other is. And the role of the Secretary General is exactly to try to bring these six into two and to make people understand that there is a win-win situation in which prevention takes the right priority and in which human suffering is reduced.
Thank you.
Mr. Guterres, thank you very much. Thank you for your response. All right, we are now going to move on to the next topic on this historic debate today. And that next topic is the issue of income and inequality, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, which is getting much wider every day. Now, at issue, of course, and the consequences of this is a mass migration of people, as we've seen, from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa into Europe, from the Middle East into Europe, also of concern, human rights, and gender issues, as well as the question of climate change and how it affects the most vulnerable people in the world. So let's hear now from one more guest here with us today on Al Jazeera. We have Bahamas' Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Sharon Brennan-Haylock. Thank you. Please stand up to ask your question. Thank you. I believe you have a question on climate change, precisely.
That's correct. And just a small correction, the Director General of Foreign Affairs from Bahamas.
Apologies. Thank you.
Thank you. So Bahamas is a small island developing state, and like many other small island developing states, we have to balance human rights concerns with development challenges, especially a grave challenge like climate change. So my question to the candidates are, if you're elected, what do you envisage is the role of the Secretary General in advancing climate change action and converging this with the Sustainable Development Agenda and human rights?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Ms. Pusic, I'll let you answer that question. Of course, we had the historic climate change deal in Paris in 2015, but this was, of course, only the first step in a very long and complicated process. So how do you, as Secretary General, make sure that each country that signed up to that agreement obey and respects their engagement?
I believe that you need public opinion as a very close ally. I took climate change really, really seriously for the first time when I saw the movie The Uncomfortable Truth. And there is nothing like actually seeing the effects of climate change. I was also deeply touched and moved by the discussions I had here with people from small island states, which showed to me how climate change is not a long-term threat, something we have to be careful with and bear in mind because eventually, sometime in the future, it's going to have an effect. It's an immediate threat. It's like nuclear weapons on some level because it's actually raising the level of the sea where they live. So I would say public opinion is an extremely important ally here. Make people see the effects and get support to act with member states.
Would you sorry, apologies, just a follow-up quickly on that. Would you as Secretary General name and shame countries who don't obey and who don't respect their engagements?
I would rather go and talk to leaders and societies but also make sure that this is seen on film, on documentaries, on data, that this is something that people can relate to as reality rather than an abstract information.
Thank you.
Vuk Jeremic, we're going to ask you about this too. Last year, very historic. Yes, the climate change deal and the sustainable development goals, but of course all of these things that people commit to are only good if they live up to them. As Secretary General, how forthright are you going to be?
Well, as a matter of fact, I believe that this is the overarching challenge of our generation, and that the two historic documents that were reached last year, that one of the first and foremost roles for the Secretary General is to make sure that they become a reality. And this is why I commit basically half of my platform to some concrete action that I intend to take to this end. But I agree with Vesna that Secretary General has to be a cheerleader in chief when it comes to the fulfillment of this. But it has to be also very oriented towards the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that were agreed when it comes to Paris in particular. So I think it's very obvious that not all the countries can reach their contributions so easily. I think that the role of the United Nations and UN country teams in particular need to be to engage with those countries to make sure that their nationally determined contributions are reached. And, but I think that we also need to engage with the private sector, because the fusion of green technologies and general partnership when it comes to this generational issue has to be put in place in order for these two grand agreements to be more than just a piece of paper next year.
Susanna Malcorra, these are things that are beyond the headlines. They were headlines when it happened, when those deals happened, but these are more important than some of the stories we do day to day on the news. Tell us your perspective.
Well, you know, it's very interesting because that shows the United Nations in different aspects. One is what happens in these rooms, in these halls, that sometimes shapes the future of the world if well done. And that is an amazing contribution of the United Nations. But going to the point of whether the SG should blame and shame or not, it's very interesting because people tend to believe that the Secretary General is the President of the United Nations of the world. And that's not the case. He is, or she is, just the Secretary General that serves 193 countries and has to have an inspirational leadership that gives the moral stature that for him or for her to move the agenda forward that has been agreed in these halls. I was very struck when we signed the commitment of the agreement here in this very same hall a few months ago, that everybody agreed that it was short of what we need to do. So for me, the pressure has to be there. The Secretary General has a role to retain that pressure. And without any doubt, there is a need to follow up with a measurement system where member states challenge themselves and measure themselves objectively.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions are called Reform and Relevance. We're here at the United Nations, 70 years old, a body designed after World War II. Is it still fit for purpose? Folly.
Yes, well, and we have on that topic a question from the Japanese ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Koro Beso. Please stand up. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Your question to our candidates today.
Yes, today we've already talked about the need for the United Nations to reform itself, and I think at the core of that is the need for the Security Council to reform itself. It has been called the unfinished agenda of the United Nations. Past Secretary Generals like Mr. Boutros-Ghali and Mr. Kofi Annan have taken initiatives as Secretary General to move forward the process of Security Council reform. What are your views, and how would you take initiative as Secretary General to move this process forward?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very important question, in fact, because many people will tell you that the United Nations really does not represent the geopolitical realities of our world today. I mean, both Latin America and Africa do not have permanent seats on the Security Council. As the Ambassador said, there have been many reforms proposed since 1993 to change that. So to Ms. German, perhaps first, what would you do to move the needle on the Security Council reform?
From my point of view, to be fit for purpose means to deliver on the values and principles reflected in the Charter of the United Nations. And this organization has proved itself to be a very adaptable body and adaptable mechanism, reforming itself when the need was there. So in case we are not fit for purpose, meaning we are not delivering on the commitments reflected in the Charter, we will continue the reform process. And it would involve, obviously, those bodies and those units, programs, agencies in the United Nations system that need to be reformed to deliver on the commitments reflected in the Charter.
Antonio Guterres, I'd like your take on this. And how difficult is this issue for a Secretary-General, talking about reform of the Security Council? It gets to that quite difficult relationship between the Secretary-General and the Security Council.
I would like to clarify that I am not here as a candidate for the Security Council, but as a candidate for Secretary-General. And having said so, I would repeat what Kofi Annan said. Kofi Annan said that the reform of the United Nations would not be completed without the reform of the Security Council. I think he was absolutely right. And I would recall that member states in 2005 have approved a resolution saying that, and it was a summit, that there would be an early reform of the Security Council. But one thing is absolutely clear. The reform of the Security Council will only be possible if the membership wants that reform and if the membership creates the consensus for that reform. I think that the Secretary-General would welcome anything that would move in that direction and would be very happy to support it, but there is no way the Secretary-General can replace the membership on this issue, as in many other issues, and this debate proved that the Secretary-General, as it was said, is not the Commander-in-Chief of the UN. It is essential that all bodies of the UN are able to work together better in the future than sometimes in the past.
Thank you very much. Vukjeremic, you have that very weighty manifesto. What does it say on this issue?
Well, this is not a secret. I'm actually a supporter of the UN Security Council reform, Mr. Ambassador, and I actually dared putting it down in writing. We'll see how it works out when it comes to the vote in the Security Council. But I do believe that today is not 1945. And I do believe that there is a need for change in many of the parts of the United Nations system. I will be advocating this change, and I will consider it a failure if my successor is elected by exactly the same Security Council as the one that will elect me towards the end of this year. But there are many other parts of the UN system where the Secretary General has a much greater and much more direct set of powers and responsibilities, which I intend to use amply, especially when it comes to the reform of the Secretariat. I list them in detail in my platform, and hopefully upon establishing credibility in reforming its own environment, the Secretary General could be a more decisive vote and voice in pushing for the Security Council reform, which I agree with Mr. Guterres is first and foremost up to the member states to decide.
Thank you. Susanna Malcorra, your take on this difficult issue for a Secretary General.
Well, definitely is well known to everybody that this Security Council does not represent the balance of power of the 21st century. It's also true that there has been already a definition of what are the variables, what are the areas that can be discussed to change the Security Council. We talk about number of members, the categories, different categories, veto power, the length of tenure, and the methods of work. So there are different things that are on the table. There is not only a single thing like the number of member states represented in the Security Council. I think, as Antonio said, that there is a need for the membership to engage in this and to open up to these different variables that are there and to think through what can be a consensus solution. Let's not hide behind the notion of the Security Council as it is today not being able to reform. The reality is that this body, the General Assembly, is the one that has to come to an agreement on how to move forward, and these are the elements of that agreement that need to be worked, and the Secretary General should help in any way that he or she can do it, but it's in this body the solution.
Thank you very much, Ms. Malcora, for your response. And thank you for all your answers, in fact, on the issue of Security Council reform, because it's a very important issue, obviously, for the next UN Secretary General. We're going to take another question now, this time not from a diplomat, but from a member of our global community, from civil society. And this is Sister Teresa Koturan. She is from India, and she's going to ask you a question. Please stand up.
My question is, what steps will you take to reform the United Nations and to appoint more women to the UN system to bridge the gender gap?
Thank you for that. I have said in my informal briefing to the General Assembly that my intention is to have a 50-50 breakdown among a senior leadership to begin with. You are totally right. Women are underrepresented, particularly in the middle level of the organization, which means that when you want to bring them up to senior leadership, you lack representation to do so. It is also true that when you ask member states to present women candidates, there is a real struggle to get there. This is not only a problem of the United Nations. I used to sit at meetings where member states were sitting on the other side, and essentially they were all men, or there was a woman in the extreme taking notes. So this is a question that goes beyond the United Nations, but of course needs to start with the United Nations leading by example, is the notion of women not being able to break that ceiling, and particularly not to be able to do it in positions of power in peace and security, which is extremely essential to move this agenda of getting to the right place with reconciliation that only women can really work.
Mr. Pusic. Vesna Pusic, sorry. I was actually going to direct my question to Mr. Jeremic because I want to hear him on the issue of women before we go to Ms. Pusic. Sorry. Mr. Jeremic, we're talking about women. There's a strong push, of course, this year for a woman to lead the United Nations because this has never happened in history. Is it time for a woman to become Secretary General, or would a feminist man be good enough?
Well, I believe that this election has to be a turning point for the role of women in this organization, come what may, whoever wins in this race, because I think this is much more, there's much more beyond who's going to be the first face of the United Nations. And this is why 11 out of 53 promises and commitments that I had made publicly available relate to women's rights and women representation in the United Nations system and beyond. I actually have committed myself to 50-50 gender parity from day one in the appointment of Undersecretary Generals or above. I put forward the concrete plan for a 5-year transition to full gender parity when it comes to SRSGs, deputy SRSGs, and country team leaders. But it is much more only than just representativeness. It's about equality of women's rights. It's about the quality of career of women in the UN and beyond. I think this, if I get elected, this is going to be one of my foremost priorities as Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jeremic. Ms. Antonio Guterres, how would you advance gender parity within the United Nations?
I think there are 3 key questions. First, to move in all our policies from a perspective of simple protection to a perspective of empowerment of women. And this is true across the board, in development, in humanitarian, in human rights, in all aspects. Empowerment is the way. The protection is absolutely essential, especially when we see those horrible violations, namely when peacekeepers themselves violate women, but protection will only work fully when empowerment will be the priority. Second is to mainstream gender on all policies instead of just focus on women. And third, in the appointments, to have a policy of parity. And again, in my vision statement, I said very clearly we need to have a clear roadmap with benchmarks and targets, because we have already that policy, but it didn't work. So now we need to be clear benchmarks, targets, and independent evaluations in the way appointments are made from top to bottom, starting by 50-50 at top level.
Okay. Thank you very much, Antonio Guterres. Maybe worth reminding me, as I ask Natalia Gurman for her take, that back in 1996, the UN General Assembly in a resolution asked for a 50-50 split between men and women for all top jobs by the year 2000, and currently the figure works out at just 22%. What's your view on this issue?
I believe that the best proof that we are determined to change the current situation would be the selection of a woman as next Secretary General of the United Nations. Because we have to lead by example, and we have to show the model of how things should be done in the world and inspire the member states to proceed in exactly the same way. We did not deliver on that commitment. We did not deliver actually on the Millennium Development Goals, one of which was the gender equality and gender parity. I think we still have a very long way to go, but we have to start now. And one of the issues, of course, is the participation and representation, first and foremost, in the decision-making process. And here in the United Nations, I would change the way the recruitment policy functions, because I would rather postpone appointment for important, even senior management positions if I don't have enough professional and qualified women candidates, and I would appeal to the member state to present me with good lists of such female candidates.
Thank you very much. Now, we're coming very much to the end, and because we're running out of time, I do want to give you all a last word. We're going to cut it now, the time down to 30 seconds, and we'll start with Vesna Pusic. Your final thoughts.
I will not make my final statement now. I will answer the question you have not asked me, but I wish you had. So I will answer the question about women in positions, in public positions. And first, I happen to be a woman. I don't think this is enough. I happen to be a feminist, and I think this is important. And it's important not because female experience of life is more important than male experience of life. But the UN was dominated for 70 years with 50% of experience of what life is. And I think we need to add the other 50%.
Antonio Guterres.
Now, just to say that I had the enormous privilege to serve in the UN for more than 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. You can't imagine what it is to be able to devote myself to the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. But you can't imagine the terrible frustration it is to see people suffering and not to have a solution for them. And this was the reason why I believe I had the obligation to present myself as a candidate to Secretary General.
Susanna Malcorra.
This is the time where we need to inspire. The United Nations needs to inspire its own people, its own staff, and it needs to inspire the world, the people outside. Because we know that without the United Nations, we have no option, we have no alternative. So I think we need a leader that can have that inspiration, that at the same time has the humbleness to listen, and has the obsession to deliver. I think I can do that, and having been at the center of the United Nations and the power making of the United Nations, I am convinced that I bring value added to.
Volkjanovich.
Well, I'm afraid that we are not so lucky to be living in easy times, and some of the challenges and some of the choices that we will have to make are going to be pretty difficult. But I do nonetheless have high hopes, because I do believe in human resilience, and I do believe in the United Nations. But if you think that we need here in this organization business as usual, and if you want more of the same old things, more of the same old faces, then I'm clearly not your candidate. But if you do share my hope of a rejuvenated, reinvigorated, agile, and transparent United Nations, then I ask you to support me so that we can try and together build an institution that we will feel proud to endow.
Natalia Gurman, please.
If I'm the next Secretary General of the United Nations, I would never cease to articulate that whatever we do in this organization, we have one major ally and partner, and this is the people. And if we manage to bring back relevance of the United Nations to the people of the world, win their hearts and minds, we have actually created this very strong and stable partnership, which translates into ownership. And if all of us feel ownership in the objectives of the United Nations, then this will be the recipe for success. Thank you.
Natalia Gurman, thank you very much. And that's where we end the first round. The first 5 candidates, we've been giving them some tough questions.
Yes.
We had some interesting but eloquent answers.
And coming up next, in not too long, we'll have 5 more candidates to the post of UN Secretary General who will be joining us, asking the same questions. Some of them will be different, but most of them will be the same. Thank you so very much for participating in this debate.
And while we wait, viewers to Al Jazeera can get a backdrop to this debate. We've been speaking all over the world to people about the United Nations, about the challenges, the problems and the successes of the organisation.
Life here is so difficult. You hardly make anything here among fellow refugees. One will be lucky to eat 2 meals a day here.
We were busy milking our cows when suddenly there was chaos. Shells were fired from all directions.
700 families escaped here when our area was attacked by Houthi militias. We don't have anything here. There are no public services.
Afghanistan is still at war, and if we go back, what will we do there? We'll be killed. Pakistan must think of us.
We're in this situation because of the Syrian government and the European Union. We're peaceful people. We love life. We're not terrorists.
When people like me lose their job, they're tempted to join armed groups, criminal gangs, or even the Taliban. We need to feed our families.
I know people I work for are very rich. It's painful to return every day to my place, but I have no choice. It's a better life than a life of crime.
This is our sad daily reality. I go out every day at 5 a.m. searching for milk.
I don't have a job. I have to do something to survive. So I go to the wild and catch animals.
There are no hospitals. The nearest one is 2 hours away. We have to walk there, even at night. No one is coming to help us.
This is no way to live. The water here isn't even fit for my daughters to bathe in.
We just want our rights. We don't want anything else. We just want rights.
I feel jealous of people with disabilities in developed countries, like Japan. All the disabled people have the same access to public transport.
Our education and culture need to be developed more.
The Brexit camp, they went for, lies, deceptions. They got no plan, no strategy, nothing. Got no leadership, got nothing.
There's no care for people. There's no care for pensioners.
They know the elections coming up, but not really looking at the issues, the things that are really concerned to the community. And people are being left out and not listened to.
I feel like they forgot us. I don't know what will they do with that big money. They should have helped the schools and the hospitals.
We see temperature rising about twice as fast as on the rest of the planet. And we see many changes in the ecosystems as a consequence of that.
It should have been much greener by now. If it does not rain, my harvest will be bad and there will be food shortages.
I am leaving with anger and sadness because hunger is forcing me to leave my homeland. If there was something to eat, I would not even think of leaving.
In the space of 24 hours, more than 60 people died.
We're from Aleppo. We came from death in Syria.
Typhoon Haiyan swept through central Philippines early Friday morning. It destroyed everything in its path.
This is not just about religion or ethnicity. At the heart of this is poverty. Around 2.5 million people need outside help just to survive.
And every morning I hope that it was a nightmare. Nepal has no choice.
We want to liberate all the territory of Luhansk and Donetsk. We want to bring them freedom.
A city under lockdown, a nation in mourning. France wakes up to a state of emergency.
She was born with an unusually small head and her brain might not develop. It's a condition that's afflicting many newborns in northeastern Brazil.
It's one of the deadliest attacks in Turkey in recent months. 3 suicide bombers arrived by taxi, then killed and wounded dozens in a well-planned operation.
He is the president of Yemen, whether the Houthis and their allies like it or not.
Our whole lives in Kuwait, we've been united, one hand, one heart. This, though, this is like a nightmare.
I'm not terrorist. This is not terrorist. This is not terrorist. This is not terrorist. We are humans.
Families in this part of South Sudan say they can't sleep out in the bush any longer.
All need to cope up together and stick together and just be optimistic regarding what's happening all around us.
Welcome back to the UN General Assembly. We are witnessing an historic event on Al Jazeera today, the first ever live televised debate of the candidates to the post of UN Secretary General. 12 candidates in total are vying for the post to replace Ban Ki-moon in January of 2017. We have 10 of them with us on Al Jazeera. We've already heard from 5 of them who've given us their vision of the United Nations and what it should be. Now we have our next panel of 5.
And of course, there are lots of people watching this on the web and on TV. If you have a comment about what you're watching here, remember you can comment on various social media platforms, hashtags AJUN Debate and hashtag Next Secretary General. The next 5 candidates are on the stage, and it's time that we introduced those 5 candidates to you. We start with Helen Clark.
Danilo Turk.
Christiana Figueres.
Igor Luksic.
Irina Bokova.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating in this historic event.
And let's get the second round of the UN debate underway. Here we go again, and it's the same format as last time, but those who perhaps didn't catch the beginning of the last programme, we're going to hear from each of the candidates about their background and why they want this job, this poison chalice of being the Secretary General of the United Nations. So let's go one by one. They have 90 seconds each to set out their stall. Helen Clark, Administrator of the UN Development Programme and the former Prime Minister of New Zealand.
It's not a poison challenge. There are many challenges the UN has to step up to, and they run across development, environment, human rights, humanitarian needs, peace and security. I know we've got the groundbreaking agendas for sustainable development and climate change, and we have to work to implement them as fast as we can. But I think where the UN is seen to be falling short is in the peace and security area. We have to get better at preventing conflict and resolving conflict. I believe the long-term answers lie in building the peaceful and inclusive societies which will talk their differences out and not fight them out. But in the short term, we have to get a lot better at anticipating those warning signs of what could spill over into serious human rights abuses and conflict. As Secretary General, in stepping up to these challenges, I would draw on my long experience of leadership and of having to make a lot of hard calls. And I do think I have the vision, the experience and the skills to lead this great organisation founded in 1945 to have a better, fairer, safer world for all its people. Thank you.
Next, Danilo Turk, former President of the Republic of Slovenia and the UN Assistant Secretary General, former for Political Affairs.
The world today needs a renovated United Nations. But in order to renovate the United Nations, we need experience, we need commitment, and we need vision. And I believe that in my 30 years of work with the United Nations, I have gained a great deal of experience in human rights, in dealing with political issues in the General Assembly and Security Council, and later as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. The interesting thing is that in all this time, my commitment to the United Nations has only grown stronger. Today, before this meeting, I met one of my friends from the indigenous community, And we talked about the times when the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples was formulated in the United Nations, and we very quickly realized what kind of action is needed today. So this is an example which shows how commitment comes from experience and how current tasks can be identified with clarity. And of course, that requires development of partnerships. UN cannot be only a club of governments. It has to have partners in the non-governmental community, in civil society generally, in academia and the business community. And I believe that tonight we'll be able to talk about this in some detail. Thank you.
Christiana Figueres headed the UN's top climate change body, and she led more than 100 countries to a global climate deal in Paris last year.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming here tonight. My vision is that of a community of nations coming together to work in a deeply collaborative manner to address the toughest problems of our planet. I know that this is difficult. I know it's difficult because I have done it. 6 years ago, I inherited a collapsed negotiation with a total deadlock in the process and with total absence of trust among all parties involved. 6 days ago, I left that process on the back of the most ambitious agreement that is unanimous, that is legally binding, and that points a clear path forward for all nations and all other stakeholders to address the issue of climate change. That was possible because with patience and determination, we collectively built a process that fully respected national interests, national needs, and national ambitions, but that was at the same time capable of identifying the common ground. That is multilateralism at its best, and that is what we need in all other areas of the United Nations, in particular in peace and security, that is at the heart of the UN. I have delivered a multilateral breakthrough. I believe that with clear leadership, together, we can and we must continue to deliver multilateral breakthroughs time after time after time.
Igor Lukšić is the former Prime Minister of Montenegro. He was until recently also his country's foreign minister.
Good evening, first of all, to all, and I have to say it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and take part in such a distinguished panel on such an important topic. First time so public, first time so open and transparent. It's been also a great pleasure to take part in the whole of the process up to now, and rightly so. Today, we're in the process that selects 1 for 7 billion, as one of the NGOs has nicely put it. But 70 years ago, it was 1 for 2 billion. And when UN turns 150, it will be 1 for 11 billion. So the world changes. Will continue to change. We have to be ready to face the change. We have to be ready to and able to respond to all the challenges we're going to face. I come from a country which 20 years ago was in the region that was engulfed in war. We had mass massacres. We had a number of different other problems. But we managed to come out of the crisis. We've managed to sustain peace. We have always been investing a lot in multi-religiousness, multiculturality of my country, and I believe we have developed also certain transitional experience that can show to the world certain examples that can be actually what the world today needs. Talking about the challenges that UN faces, we quite often point to the need that we have to respect some of the major principles, like 50% gender parity, rightly so. But what I also like to emphasize is another 50% of the world's population. They are under 25. We have to work, we have to prepare UN, we have to work for them, because that's the generation to come, and we have to prepare a world for them.
Thank you. Irina Bokova is the Director General of UNESCO, and she served as an acting foreign minister for Bulgaria.
First, James, thank you for this opportunity to Al Jazeera and, of course, to the President of the General Assembly. There are two reasons which gave me the audacity and the courage to be a candidate for this important position. The first, of course, is the great privilege of serving an organization like UNESCO for the last 7 years, which has a wide-range mandate, and I would say a beautiful mandate, the soft power of the United Nations, to promote education, to promote culture, intercultural dialogue, to protect world's heritage, to give all the power of the sciences, of new technologies, to give also and work for the promotion of the freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, to protect journalists. And I believe nowadays the challenges that are in front of us with the conflict, with the humanitarian situations, with the climate change, ask for more United Nations, ask for more engagement, for more of the soft power of the United Nations. And the second reason is I'm a deep believer in multilateralism, coming from a country that is multicultural, a bridge between the East and the West. And coming from East Europe, we in Eastern Europe, and I turn to Igor and to Danilo, have gone through a profound change. We know what transformation of society is. We know what it is to make democratic societies and to instill some democratic values. And I think we are deep believers precisely because of that. So I think that with this experience, I can serve the United Nations.
Thank you very much. Well, there we have it. This panel of 5 candidates setting out their stall in 90 seconds. If you weren't watching last time around, now we change the rules a bit because now we go to questions and they get just 60 seconds when they get a question. The reason for that is to try and get the candidates to say as much as possible on as many things as possible, and we behind the scenes have people with stopwatches trying to make sure that everyone has the same time. Questions coming from me and Folly, and Folly's got some people to speak to as well there in the General Assembly.
Indeed, I'm on the floor of the UN General Assembly, and like in the last hour, we'll have questions from the diplomats here, as well as people from civil society who are our guests. Some of our guests are from here today. The first question is from Poland's ambassador to the United Nations, Bogusław Winit. Mr. Ambassador, your question.
Thank you, Folly, for organizing this historical debate. Well, my question concerns the principle of geographical rotation of the key positions in the United Nations, including, of course, the position of Secretary General, the system which was adopted roughly 50 years ago. Well, my question is, should we exclude some positions from the geographical rotation principles, and if so, why? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. A very good question. We'll put that question first to Ms. Irina Bokova. Which would make you most proud today, Ms. Bokova? To be the first Eastern European to be Secretary General, or the first woman?
My response is in 2 seconds, both.
No, you have to choose one. Well, okay, then answer the ambassador's question about geographical representation. Should some positions within the UN be exempted from geographical representation?
Again, my response is in 1 second, none.
Can you elaborate, Ms. Bokova, for our audience?
Well, I think, if you allow me to enlarge a little bit the question, I think geographical distribution is important. And I think, and I'm trying to make in my organization in UNESCO this as a rule. We have in our secretariat of less than 1,200 people, 161 countries represented. And I have made a deliberate effort to make as wide as possible geographical distribution. I think this is important for the culture, this is important for the representation of all the regions, of all the countries, be it small, distant, big, powerful. I think this is extremely important, and I have done it by example at UNESCO.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Ms. Helen Clark, on that same question of geographical representation, the very unofficial rotation of who gets the Secretary General position this year says it should be Eastern Europe. There are 7 candidates from Eastern Europe. What is your view on that? Should Eastern Europe be getting the Secretary General position, even though, you know, in terms of population, this is the smallest region in the world that's represented at the United Nations?
I think if you allow me to enlarge a little bit the question, I think geographical distribution is important. And I think, and I'm trying to make in my organization in UNESCO this as a rule. We have in our secretariat of less than 1,200 people, 161 countries represented. And I have made a deliberate effort to make as wide as possible geographical distribution. I think this is important for the culture, this is important for the representation of all the countries, be it small, distant, big, powerful. I think this is extremely important, and I have done it by example at UNESCO.
Okay, thank you very much.
My country belongs to a grouping for electoral purposes at the UN called Western Europe and Others Group. I'm from the Others. And sometimes I think WEOG should stand for Western European and Orphans, because my little country is from the South Pacific and it's never had a Secretary General either. So I really think that when we look at the scale of the challenges our world is facing, we need a global search for the best talent. This is a critical job, the best talent.
Danilo Turk, I'd like your perspective on this as an Eastern European political leader in the past.
Yes.
What do you think of rotation of the Secretary-General's job, and is it your bloc's turn?
I think that geographical rotation is indispensable. It's an instrument of fairness, and if we want to establish fair and decent processes in this organization, then we have to work on the basis of rotation among different groups. Now, of course, there were proposals in the past to reform the groupings for electoral purposes, and these discussions will continue. Hopefully one day there will be change. But now that's the arrangement that we have. And I believe that's an important instrument of fairness that we have to retain and we have to use wisely. But there is one thing that I would like to emphasize in addition to whatever else one can say about regional groups, and that is the Secretary General has to serve the whole organization. The Secretary General is not an East European or non-East European. The Secretary General belongs to the whole organization, and my candidature is based on that, and I appreciate the fact that the process this year has really been inspired by this idea.
Thank you very much. Igor Luksic, if I can ask you about this, there seem to be two competing things, none of it written down, but a convention that it goes around the different parts of the world, and Eastern European hasn't had it yet, but neither has a woman had it. Why do you think, or do you think, after 70 years, it's time for a female Secretary General? I know it's a hard question for you.
A very difficult one to respond, because I cannot help it. I mean, first of all, I think it is all right that Eastern European group has the chance to offer candidates. Actually, I believe it will be okay if the smallest country from the Eastern European group actually enjoys having a Secretary General eventually selected. But I think this is, again, not so much about regional rotation. I think it is also about challenges we're facing in today's world. And even if there was no principle of regional rotation, even unwritten one anywhere, or I mean written or unwritten, whatever, I would be considering this possibility, because I believe that UN needs a new approach, needs something new. Humankind has always been in the situation to make hard choices, but we are living in a world which changes and which requires also difficult choices, and therefore I think we need a different UN. But I also believe that our argument stands well, that Eastern European group should have a fair opportunity to offer candidates, and eventually somebody can be selected Secretary General.
Thank you very much for that response. I will put that question now to Ms. Cristiana Figueres. The Eastern Europeans say it is their time to be Secretary General. Your response.
Let's be very clear. There is a sentiment that it would be the turn of Eastern Europe, and I very much appreciate the fact, and I'm sorry to correct you, but I believe there are 8 candidates from Eastern Europe, not just 7. 3 of them women and 5 men, and I very much appreciate all of that willingness on the part of that region to stand forward and be willing to take on this responsibility. The candidacy of Costa Rica is in no way a disrespect for that sentiment, but rather it has the intent of opening up options, of displaying all of the different leadership possibilities that there are in order to allow the Security Council and the General Assembly to make a decision that is as informed as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Figueres. And there are indeed 8 candidates from Eastern Europe competing for the job of UN Secretary General. Now let's get into a very important issue, and that is crisis and conflict. As we mentioned, The world we live in today is experiencing crisis like never before. There is the war in Syria, there is Iraq, of course, and those wars with the refugee crisis they've created as well. Now, we want to talk about how, as Secretary General, you would solve these crises. We will go first to a question from our audience here, and this is Christian Thibault, who is a Brazilian student who's just joined us from Brazil, especially for this event. So if you could please give him a round of applause. He's very excited to be here. Now, Christian is going to be speaking in Portuguese, and then I will tell you what he says after he asks his question. Christian.
O fato do Conselho de Segurança ser composto por apenas 5 países como membros permanentes gera desequilíbrio entre as nações, tendo em vista o poder de veto que tais países possuem. Quais as medidas que poderiam ser tomadas para tornar este Conselho de Segurança mais justo e igualitário?
Thank you very much, Christian. This question is... Thank you. Well done, thank you. The question is about Security Council reform, of course. The fact, he says, that the UN Security Council is composed of only 5 permanent members, given their veto power, generates a power imbalance between nations. What measures could be undertaken, he says, to make sure the Security Council is more just and egalitarian? Let's put that question perhaps to Mr. or a lady. Let's try Ms. Helen Clark.
Well, 2 issues there. One is about the composition of the Security Council, and the other is about the decision-making in the Security Council. On the composition, we have a council which reflects 1945, the end of World War II settlement. 10 years ago, the member states had a good go at trying to reform it. It didn't get to conclusions. The debate is raging again. If there's anything I can do as Secretary General to facilitate that debate, have the organisation offer technical options, legal advice, I will do that. Secondly, on the decision making, I would like to think I could contribute to building a better culture of trust between key parties on the Council, because the Security Council works best when there isn't polarisation on it, when everybody is seized of the importance of solving a threat to peace and security. And heaven knows we see a lot of real threats, actual threats to peace and security right now. So we have to redouble our efforts in the search for peace. What were some of the starting words of the Charter? That the UN must strive to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We're not doing so well.
You spoke there about when the Security Council is divided and getting things done. Cristiana Figueres, if I could pick that up with a specific example, and it's the awful one. 5.5 years of war in Syria. No one really is counting the dead. The UN figures say 250,000. It may be more. We have a process which is Geneva talks going nowhere. They're supposed to have come up with some sort of political transition by the 1st of August. Well, if we look at our calendars, we're pretty close there, and the talks haven't even restarted. How do you navigate this issue, given that it's very hard to get the Security Council to agree on anything?
Well, I do think that it is a remarkable example of deadlock in the Security Council, and if there's any reform that is very urgent, in fact even more urgent than restructuring the Security Council, it's reforming the way that the 5 members work with each other so that they can get out of deadlock, because that is their responsibility. I would use the full offices of the Secretary General to work with all the P5s to get to a common understanding that respects their differences and their different interests in the region, but that also allows them to move to common ground, because ultimately peace is the common interest of all. It is the common interest of all of the P5s, it is the common interest of all of the member states of the General Assembly, and it is the common interest of every single one of the 7 billion people on this planet.
Thank you very much. Let me try with another example, Irina Bokova, a conflict that goes back till the very early days before the origins, in fact, of the conflict before the UN was founded, and that's the situation with Israel-Palestine. Again, quite hard to get action in the Security Council. The last time they tried a resolution, it was blocked. It wasn't voted on by a majority of the Council, and one of the veto members, one of the P5, actually voted against it. There hasn't actually been a resolution in the Security Council on this issue since the end of the Gaza war in 2009, and we've had 2 Gaza wars since.
You're right that this is one of the conflicts, one of the issues that is surfacing and still requires a lot of efforts. What I think here, in order to implement the resolutions, adopted resolutions by the Security Council, and what is also the will of the General Assembly and the United Nations to have a 2-state solution, and two states living in peace, to have the security for both states, we need to build trust. What I see now these last years is lack of trust, lack of a political process, lack of trust, practically no negotiations, no contacts, and I think the first of the responsibilities of a future Secretary General will be to start rebuilding trust between the negotiating parties. I think this is extremely important. If we don't have trust, I think this will continue to be one of those protracted crises.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bokova, for that response. Now, Mr. Danilo Turk, I want to ask you not about how you would break the deadlock in the Security Council on Syria or the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but specifically a message to the people affected by these conflicts, on Syria, for instance. According to the most conservative estimates, 250,000 people have died in Syria. 4.6 million people are displaced, are refugees. The Syrian voices that we hear on Al Jazeera say they feel let down by the international community. They feel abandoned by the United Nations. As Secretary General, what would be your message to those people? What hope can you offer them?
This, of course, is a very difficult question, because UN has lost much of its credibility in Syria. I would like to remind ourselves that former Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was the first joint envoy for United Nations and the Arab League, came with a plan 4 years ago, and that plan was not accepted. And later, many years later, the same ideas came to the fore. Now, UN has lost a lot of credibility in that regard. Now, I think that the way to regain credibility requires several steps. First, there has to be more humanitarian assistance to deal with the immediate needs. There were some improvements recently, but much more needs to be done. Secondly, the Secretary General has to work with Stefan de Mistura and the Security Council to come to specific proposals before September this year. Now, of course, this relates to the current Secretary General. And the next Secretary General will have to take from there. And if we work together, then possibly we can regain the necessary trust which was so sadly lost.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Luksic, as Mr. Turk alluded to there, 3 of the most experienced diplomats in the world have tried to solve the Syria crisis and have failed so far. If you're selected as the next Secretary General of the United Nations, will you take charge of this crisis personally? Will you take the lead?
Well, I think Secretary General has to take the lead. That's inevitable. I cannot imagine a Secretary General shunning problems. I think Secretary General must be proactive and facing, encountering problems. That's the only way it can be. That is what people expect. And maybe sometimes there's exaggeration, maybe sometimes there's too high expectations and so on. But I think that's what we need. We need more energy, we need more proactiveness, we need more interaction, and that's the only way it can go. I think that we finally need to start drawing lessons from problems, lessons from crises. We just cannot let it go on like this forever. One terrorist attack after another, and press statements expressing condolences and concerns. People are growing disillusioned, and then again, United Nations will lose both influence, and people will lose interest in the United Nations. So I think we need to go back one step and rethink the approach. I think we need, again, more interaction, more cooperation. I think we need more honest discussions, and that's the only way it can go. Plus, I believe that it takes also different modifications within the UN so that both Security Council and peace-building commissions are actually in the position to have more high-quality inputs to make political decisions.
Thank you very much indeed for that response, Mr. Luksic. We're going to take another question now from the floor, and this is a representative from the Liechtenstein mission to the United Nations, Jorn Oliver Ehrman. Your question.
Thanks. The United Nations has been undermined by several instances of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, including of minors. How do you think the UN should best address this issue?
A very important question indeed. Ms. Cristiana Figueres, there have been several reports of sexual abuse by peacekeepers in the Central African Republic in the last 2 years, over 100 cases reported. What action would you put in place on day one as Secretary General to make sure that these abuses stop and never happen again?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer this, because I have a track record of zero tolerance of sexual abuse in the institution in which I had the honor to lead. And it is that zero tolerance that would guide me, not from day one, but from day zero. And it is the one that we should all actually ascribe to. Immunity cannot be impunity. All those who have been proven or would be proven after a very serious and robust investigation to be guilty of sexual abuse must be held to account. This is the only way to reestablish the integrity of our very, very hard-working and very courageous peacekeeping forces.
Thank you very much. Ms. Helen Clark, of course, everyone condemns these abuses. Everyone, has strong words against them. But what do we do to prevent them from happening in the first place?
First thing is to make sure that all troops being dispatched to wear the blue helmet are fully trained and aware of the consequences of committing these horrific acts against the populations they're supposed to be protecting, not preying on. Secondly, any whisper of abuse should be reported, and when reported, promptly taken up. That should mean those troops or trooper being suspended, probably sent home, and then the country's judicial system is expected to prosecute, and if someone is found guilty, to be punished accordingly. If countries aren't prepared to do that, then I think the UN has to be prepared to say no thanks in future, because the blue helmet reputation is a precious reputation, and it has been very tarnished what has happened in these horrific cases which have come to public attention.
Helen Clark, thank you very much. UN peacekeeping under quite a bit of a burden if you just look at the number of peacekeepers. 103,000 peacekeepers at the moment. Back in the year 2000, just 1,800. Igor Luksic, if you look at that, do you think perhaps some of the standards have been lowered and we need more stringent vetting and better training?
Well, look, I mean, this is an evident issue we're dealing with. As you say, 15 years ago there was 30,000 peacekeepers roughly. Now we have more than 100,000. We've seen the growth in special political missions. So the overall growth in the budget is tremendous, from $2.5 billion 15 years ago to between 7 and 8 billion. So this is huge amount of money. And at the same time, I don't think that there can be anything more discrediting, more shameful than the revelation of the fact that peacekeepers acted against sexual abuse and acted against civilians. For God's sake, that's the point of sustaining a peacekeeping mission. So obviously there's something to be changed, and not only do I think that those contingents should be removed immediately and trialed and so on, I think that this story cannot really end unless there is individualization of the guilt in that particular case or any particular case of that kind, because that's the point. I think UN should also be able to lead in terms of morality, because that's what people expect from this organization.
Thank you very much. I want to get the perspective of Mr. Turk now and add something in, which is the way the UN responded to this. As you know, a senior UN official, Anders Kompass, raised this issue, ended up getting suspended, then exonerated, and now feels that he's had to resign because there's a lack of accountability.
Yes, the experience of Anders Kompass is a very unfortunate experience, and we in the United Nations have to take lessons from this whole experience and look at who and how the process, who and how did hinder the process? What were the obstacles to prevent really timely investigations, timely scrutiny? Now, this has been, continues to be a very big problem for the United Nations, and I think that we have to bring Anders Kompass back into the family. I know Anders Kompass. I worked with him when he was engaged in Colombia, and I have very high opinion of him, and I hope that we can still bring him back to the United Nations.
Okay, well, we're going to move on from this to our next round of questions, which are a round of questions on income and equality, examining the difference between the haves and the have-nots, obviously a growing gap in the world. Folly.
Yes, and for that we will go to the Tunisian ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Mohamed Khaled Kiari, who has a question for the candidates. Mr. Kiari.
Shukran. How can the right to development be better integrated in the work of the UN system? And how do you envisage the role of the incoming Secretary General in contributing toward the creation of a conducive environment to achieve the 2030 Development Agenda, in particular Goal 17, on strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will translate. Ms. Bokova, the ambassador asks, how can the right development be better integrated in the UN system, and how can the Secretary General contribute?
The Secretary General will have an enormous leadership role in the implementation of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. I would say that this was a huge achievement of the United Nations, adopting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are universal, which are changing the paradigm of development, which are very much owned by countries and by governments. And nowadays we see that more than 70 countries already have adopted their national plans. How to mobilize the United Nations system, how to reform the United Nations system to make it adequate, relevant, to accompany governments in the implementation of these goals is the biggest challenge that we face. Overcoming the fragmentation of the system, complementarity, of having a coherent approach, of involving the regional approach, of making the unfinished business also being done, the leftovers from the Millennium Development Goals is extremely important. And from that point of view, I do believe that the leadership of the Secretary General is enormous in this particular area, of making the system adequate, coherent, and overcome the fragmentation.
Thank you very much for that. Ms. Figueres, one of the consequences of this widening gap between the rich and poor has been the mass migration of people from Africa into Europe, from the Middle East into Europe, the refugee crisis, but also the migrants crisis. I wonder, as Secretary General, how would you change the system to make the United Nations deal better with this crisis that we're experiencing, an unprecedented crisis, the worst refugee crisis since the end of the Second World War?
That is absolutely correct. Today we have 65 million migrants either displaced either inside the country or outside, the largest number that we have ever had, and putting an enormous strain on all humanitarian aid organizations, including the United Nations. It's very clear that unless we look at migration from its all perspective, we will not be able to do this. So we usually think of migration as being a humanitarian issue. Actually, migration, forced migration, has to do with peace and security, it has to do with human rights, it has to do with development. So one way to look at this is to first start with human rights and ensure that all of those who are being forced to migrate away are being treated with dignity and in full respect of their human rights. Secondly, we have to have a system that actually shares better global responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of the countries that are right there. There's global responsibility to be shared. And thirdly, we have to look at the root causes of this migration and work in a preventive way to not let migration duplicate or triplicate, which it would do unless we pay that attention.
Thank you very much for your responses today. Thank you. Mr. Danilo Turk, on that same issue of migration and the refugee crisis, how would you as Secretary General make sure that the most vulnerable people who flee war and conflicts, poverty in their countries, are treated in a good manner in the host countries that they are, that the host countries who receive these people adhere to the responsibilities, their responsibilities under international law?
International law has to be implemented, and the commitment to international law on refugee issues and on other relevant issues is central to the policy that the UN has to lead. Now, of course, there have to be practical measures to implement the international legal standards. And one of the aspects which I think have been largely neglected in the discussions on refugees and migration was how to ensure that people who find themselves in these situations also can work. There has to be something done for better employment opportunities in the countries of asylum, and there has to be a mobilization of international resources and will to go in that direction. There have been recent studies which have shown that in Jordan or Lebanon, for example, the number of refugees are such and the economic situation is such that it would actually call for international investment. And I think that that is the strategic direction in which the United Nations has to go and where changes have to happen.
Helen Clark, I'd like to ask you about migration, but I'd like to bring in another aspect, which is the response in some of the countries where people arriving, whether they be economic migrants or refugees are arriving, and the racism, the xenophobia, the anger that we're seeing appearing.
This is very disturbing, and I speak as someone who has seen the acceptance of refugees into my own country, and I would say without reservation that those refugees have repaid the hospitality of my country thousands of times over. They are good people looking for a fresh start. And that is the approach we must take. People don't flee their home for no reason. They flee because their society is destroyed around them. Their kids can't in school, they can't earn a living, the services are broken down. Any of us in that situation would flee. And then the first point of call may be to a tent nearby. I was in one of the many refugee camps in a neighbouring country, and I sat with a family who'd been small farmers in Syria. I said, "How long have you been in this tent?" 3.5 years. Wouldn't any of us try to find another option? Full marks to Turkey, which has made it possible for Syrians to enter the workforce. Jordan has begun to offer such permits. I hope Lebanon will follow. But these countries need support too, because they're carrying a global burden in their hospitality to refugees.
Thank you very much. If I'd like to bring in bring in Igor Luksic on this issue. Obviously, the Syria crisis is swelling the numbers, but we're seeing so many people moving around from country to country. This is something we're going to have to get used to forever now, aren't we?
Well, I hope not forever, but
people want to move.
Absolutely, and it's not. I mean, 65 million people are on the move, but there is a lot more people who want to resettle. And just imagine all of them. I think it's some research shows it's about 200 million people they want from economic reasons to resettle somewhere else. Technically, it may lead to the increase of GDP, world GDP, in the short run. In the long run, it would bring devastating polarization of income, as many skillful people would leave those developing countries. So that's a very important aspect we need to take into account, and that's why Sustainable Development Agenda also recognizes migration issues. But let me also turn and comment on more immediate problem of migration, which, I mean, my country was not on that route, but we were in the neighborhood of the Western Balkans route, and we've been seeing that. 17 years ago, in my country, there was 20% of the population who were refugees or internally displaced people. So I really understand problems Jordan, Lebanon, other countries are facing today. And compared to that, I mean, European problem is really minuscule. So we need to make sure that refugees, if they want to resettle, and it's very difficult to return, the repatriation is at the lowest level compared to what we had in 80s. So the only way forward is probably through a combination of humanitarian and development aid. We need to focus on development. When asked about my concerns related to current world, it's the lack of development. We must not let it happen.
And if I can have a follow-up question with you, the other problem we haven't talked about this is raising the funds the UN so desperately needs. All of its funding for these issues is below the targets.
And the interesting thing is, there's a lot of money in the world. There's a lot of money people want to use to invest. Private companies, private sector, many other donors. So I think one of the roles of the next Secretary General and his or her team will be actually not about reinventing the wheel. It will be actually to make sure that we are able to build partnerships with other donors, with other regions, to mobilize resources and wisdom to make sure that we are able to respond to the challenges. So money exists. So we need to make sure that we are effective and convincing enough so that money is used for proper purpose.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Bokova, a question to you about the fact that in many countries, resources to combat the trends of, this widening gap between rich and poor are really scarce. What will you do, for instance, to reduce gender discrimination precisely, and violence against women in some of the developing countries where we see women increasingly targeted?
I believe that one of the probably most effective tool of bridging the inequality is education. And I would say that from the point of view of social mobility, there is nothing better than educating people. I think there should be a massive investment in education, which is, of course, one of the goals of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. And when I say education, of course, I mean girls' education, women, adolescent girls, because we know the impact of education on the health, on girls staying in schools. Every year a girl stays in school, adds income to her family. She is not married off, she is not pregnant, she is not being violated, and we need to create all the enabling environment for girls to go to school. I think if we have to have a face of this agenda of sustainable development, maybe we should take a photo of a girl that is 12 years, 10, 12 years, that is continuing to go to school, to a safe school, that is not married off, that is supported by her family and her community, and then she is empowered to continue with her life.
I'd like to ask you now a specific question about a country that is one of the poorest in the world and certainly one of the poorest in the Americas. A question about Haiti, because the UN's involvement in Haiti is one that some have found very controversial. Clearly, there has been this outbreak of cholera. Now, the official figures say 9,200 people have died from cholera in Haiti. Many believe the figures are much higher than that. Most scientists you talk to believe that the UN peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti. So maybe we can have a show of hands. As Secretary General, would any of you admit responsibility and apologise to the people of Haiti? Who would do that? If you can perhaps explain why, please. Explain why for me, and then we'll speak to the others.
Because I believe that the integrity of the United Nations also on that has actually been tarnished. That was an unintended consequence of a very important goal of the United Nations, unintended consequence. But we have to be responsible even for unintended consequences. If I go to the 38th floor, I will make sure that during my tenure, we completely eradicate malaria and cholera from Haiti through, and the advantage of that is that we will actually increase the sanitation level and the health levels overall. But that is a responsibility, a moral responsibility that the United Nations has and that must be fulfilled.
If I could have a quick yes or no follow-up. You say you'll apologise. Will you pay the compensation, yes or no?
No, the United Nations is not in a position to pay the consequences. But more importantly, the United Nations is called upon, as I said, to make sure that that disease is eradicated and that furthermore it never happens again in any other country.
Let's speak to someone who didn't raise their hand. Helen Clark.
What I learned as a Prime Minister was no matter how tempting it might be to comment on a case before the courts, it's not wise to do so. We have a case on this before the courts in this country. What I know is that people have died, as you said, children are orphaned, people have lost loved ones because of this. Has the international response to that situation been sufficient? No. Cholera is still in Haiti. So the critical thing now is to rally support for Haiti to have better water and sanitation for its people, better living conditions, and for the families who have been so damaged by what has happened to be able to rebuild their lives. If there are issues of sanitation in UN camps, which there may well be, let us attend to that, because UN peacekeepers shouldn't be living in squalor either, if that is going to cause a problem, as it will, not only to them, but to a surrounding neighbourhood. So we've got a lot of work to do to put things right for the people of Haiti.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Helen Clark. We're now going to move on to our next topic of discussion, and that is the relevance of the United Nations today and whether it's time to reform it. As we've said, this is a 70-year-old organization, and while it can claim a number of successes, there is also criticism of the United Nations for being disconnected and disjointed. The Security Council, for instance, is described by many as a private members club, and a lot of people have called for a reform of the Security Council. So we're going to take a question. I know we'll get into that in just a bit more, but a question first from the Chilean ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Christian Barros.
Gracias, thank you. This is a very simple question, but it's really important. We would like to know your proposal for increasing the funding of UN human rights system. Of course, including the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, from the regular UN budget and in more equitable way, in light of the dramatic increase in needs on the ground and demands for technical assistance from member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Irina Bokova, the needs on the ground today are tremendous. $26 billion needed for humanitarian relief alone. How do you increase the funding? Where do you get the money from?
Well, I think that overall United Nations system, particularly in the humanitarian are underfunded. We know this fact. And of course, I know that we have to become more efficient in order to tell the donors and to tell the partners that we can deliver what is expected from us. I believe this is an issue that needs a lot of support of member states. Definitely, the Secretary General should take the lead and propose a very committed debate around it. Unfortunately, it is not the Secretary General that adopts the budget of this organization, but I do believe that in terms of supporting the Office of the High Commissioner, to support the missions of the High Commissioner in different places on protecting human rights, linked also to the political mission, is very much underfunded. I will fight for a bigger chunk of the fund, of the budget of the United Nations, both regular and extra budgetary resources for the political missions, including for the missions of human rights.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bokova, for that. Mr. Danilo Turk, a question for you now. Former UN Assistant Secretary General Anthony Bambari described the UN as a failure due to colossal mismanagement. He says, and I quote, "The system is a black hole into which disappear countless tax dollars and human aspirations." So how would you address, for instance, institutional corruption and the misuse of resources within the United Nations, especially in humanitarian settings?
Now, the articles like the one from Mr. Bambari are welcome. This is criticism. Mr. Bambari has left the United Nations and then published his critical remarks. We have to value this, and we have to find ways. One of the first things I would do as Secretary General, I would have a thorough discussion with the Office of Internal Oversight to see what exactly this office and other inspection mechanisms in the United Nations are doing right now and how we can improve the inspection capacity of the United Nations. That is what we have to do. But that's only something that helps with part of the problem. We have to do more to deal with other aspects of Mr. Bambari's critique, which had to do with recruitment and rotation. And there, I think the Secretary General can move really very quickly. I would establish a small working group to make proposals for change that would shorten the time needed for recruitment. And this can be done in a few months. The proposals can be made in a few months. And then from that, we can go on into rotation and other personnel issues. So in short, inspections are critical, but they would not do. They have to be combined with other measures.
Thank you very much for that. James?
Thank you. Yes, Helen Clark, I'm going to come back actually to Anthony Bambari's comments because he was a very senior UN official. He even headed the Ebola mission of the UN. He said, and this is an amazing quote, "If you locked a team of evil geniuses in a laboratory, they could not design a bureaucracy so maddeningly complex." Well, is that the UN that you see every day, and how does it need to change?
Talking to many people in the Secretariat, I find a great many who agree with what he said. I want to bring to this job my experience, both as a Prime Minister, running a reformed public administration in New Zealand, and running a reorganisation at UNDP, where we managed to keep delivering the same amount of programming, actually with fewer staff, fewer managers, more people going out to the field where they were closer to country, and eradicating duplication of function. I know this can be done, and I think it's a question of good people, poor systems. So let's reward the good people with some good systems.
Thank you very much. If I can put that to you, Christiana Figueres, you have been leading climate change. If you come in as the UN Secretary General to UN headquarters, are you the change candidate when it comes to all this bureaucracy?
I think it could be. I think I have had not only zero tolerance for sexual abuse, for corruption, and for inefficiency, but a true commitment. I would agree actually with my colleague Helen, because the very hard-working staff of the United Nations are currently not being served by an institution whose processes have been historically over years changed 100 times so that you don't even know where they actually started. And we have been able to cut through from 10 steps down to 1, from 21 steps down to 3. It is actually possible to simplify the processes. We don't need that many steps. So yes, it has to be done. It is completely unacceptable that we're currently at an average of 18 months to hire anybody. That just cannot be. It cannot be for the routine jobs of the United Nations, and it most certainly cannot be for emergency issues that have to do with peace and security.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Figueres, for that response. We're going to take a last question from one of the ambassadors here with us at the General Assembly today, and that's the ambassador of Indonesia to the United Nations, Mr. Jan Trase Jani. Thank you.
Noting the many challenges that are facing the world today and the limited financial resources of the UN, as well as the expectation of members, what would be the most important initiatives that are innovative that you would like to implement in terms of the UN management reform? And do you think that the UN Secretariat is too large or is it too small?
Thank you. Perhaps to Mr. Luksic.
Thank you. Well, there are two principal actions I'd like to take in this field. One is the reshuffle of the Chief of Executives Board for Coordination by replacing the existing 3 committees or groups with 3 but different ones in order to overcome the detachment that there exists, I believe, between the Secretariat and the agencies, funds and programs, by setting up so-called UN Peace Operations Group, but also UN Sustainable Development Group, which is not only a name change from the existing development group, and UN Programs Management Budget Group, because we need to make sure that budgets are harmonized. Core budget of the United Nations needs to be harmonized with other budgets. Second principal action I'd like to do immediately, very early in the office, is to set up a panel of international experts that should do a review of the current spending of the budget to make sure that we are able to understand and identify potential economies, but also inefficiencies. Look, it's been really striking to me to learn at a certain representation I attended that about 20% of the humanitarian aid funding has been inefficiently spent. And one of the proposals is actually to embrace modern technologies. The blockchain technology, for example, can solve a lot of the problems. So UN should be leading the effort in offering new opportunities rather than standing in the back, probably still closed or imprisoned in 80s or in 20th century.
Thank you very much. Now, Irina Bokova, you are based at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. When you fly in here to the UN in New York, do you see lots of possible savings? Do you see ways of making this run more efficiently?
Well, I can say about the experience that we have in UNESCO. People probably do not know that for 5 years we are without 22% of our regular budget. And I had to make a profound reform of the organization to cut the red tape, to decrease the levels of management, and at the same moment to protect also the geographical distribution and to increase the gender representation. In gender, we are arriving at almost a parity. I started with 24%, and now we are at the 47%, and I hope by the end of my mandate that I will be at the parity, at the highest level. And at the same time, I had to decrease a lot of the administrative expenses and strengthen the internal oversight service, to strengthen the ethics, to install a whistleblower policy and to anti-fraud policy. So a lot of experience gained in these very challenging times. I do believe that a review of the administration is necessary. There was an important report of the International Civil Service as a chair of the high-level group of management, high-level committee of management. I was very much supporting and instrumental so that this be adopted by the General Assembly.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bokova. Now I'm going to veer off a little bit of our topic and ask you just a simple question, Ms. Figueres. If you're not selected as the next Secretary General, what are you going to do?
Actually, that is a simple question. And it's a simple question because although I would regret not having the opportunity and the privilege to serve member states and the world in the way that I would like to, I'm not giving up the fight. Wherever I am, I shall continue to work on climate change, on development, on prevention of all the atrocities that we're seeing, and above all, I shall continue to sound the voice of alarm. We have not realized the emergency that we are dealing with. I have publicly invited everyone to swallow an alarm clock and to rise to the urgency of what we are facing. I will continue to do that.
Right, but it precisely... In what capacity would you assist the next Secretary General if you were not to be the next Secretary General?
That would remain to be decided by the next Secretary General.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Figueres. James?
Yes, we're getting quite a bit of feedback, or some feedback, that earlier on we referred to Macedonia. As we know, here in this room in the UN General Assembly, it's the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. I think now we're going to get your final thoughts on where things stand. A chance, and we're going to set the clock now to 30 seconds rather than 60, but just anything left over or the final impression that you want to give to our viewers and to those here in the UN General Assembly. Irina Bokova.
If I am selected for this post, I will definitely be a big fighter for intercultural dialogue, for tolerance, for peace, to overcome divisions. I'm a deep believer into living together. And I think the United Nations should do more in order to prevent, should do more in order to instill this feeling of a common community, of community that is united around certain values. And I think because of my experience at UNESCO with fighting extremism, of protecting heritage and culture, will be something that will give me the strength to introduce this at the United Nations.
Igor Lukšić, if you can please give us your final thoughts.
Well, I've always tended to look at the glass half full, and therefore I think that our really immediate task is to strive to build back optimism. I think we need it. International context is complicated, but the UN has the ability to build back optimism. So what I'd like to do is to engage with the young people. I'd like to engage and reach out to all the stakeholders. I'd like to develop a vision of extending partnerships and better coordination. And I'd like to rely upon principles of inclusiveness, engagement and responsibility. That's what I believe should be the vision of the next Secretary General.
Christiana Figueres, please.
I would like to address a very important letter that was written by the staff of the United Nations and that I had the pleasure of reading just a few minutes before coming on stage tonight. I am deeply impressed by the eloquent call for leadership on the part of the staff of the United Nations. I am humbled by the dedication of a very, very hard-working team who works in the field to make the impossible possible under very extenuating circumstances. And I would be deeply honored to lead that dedicated team so that together we can further serve humanity.
Danilo Turk, please, your final comments in 30 seconds.
In this discussion, we have heard many critical views, but let us not forget, United Nations is also an organization consisting of people. And we have in the Secretariat wonderful people. I know some of them, I know how hard they work, many of them in difficult situations, and some risking their lives. So we have to be not only humble, but also proud that this organization is capable of bringing such a wonderful group together into an organized action. And I think that this is an asset. This is the most important asset of the United Nations, which the Secretary General has to respect, to cultivate, and to improve.
Helen Clark is next with her final 30-second thoughts.
Being Secretary General would be an incredible privilege and an incredible opportunity to work for peace, development and human rights, to work for that better, safer, fairer world. I have every energy to put into this task. These are issues I've worked on all my life, and I would really relish the challenge of this position to carry on that work and try to build that better future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our candidates, the 5 that are here now and the 5 that were here before. So 10 of the candidates. Remember, there are actually 12 candidates in this race for the job of UN Secretary-General. Probably worth explaining to the audience at home what happens next. It's not a vote of these people. It's a vote of a very different body. The UN Security Council gets the final vote. What's happening in the next week, just over a week, is the Security Council is having its first straw poll.
But we do want to hear from our viewers about who you think came out on top today of the 10 candidates who were here, who did well, who you think should be the next UN Secretary General. Join us on social media using the hashtag NextSG. That's it for this historic event. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.